Hello everyone, I'm Matt Bristow and welcome to another in Cherry Red TV series profiling independent record labels. Cherry Red Records celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, which is a significant landmark for any independent label. Today's guest is Cherry Red founder and chairman Iain McNay. Hello Iain.
Hi.
Iain, today we're going to look at the early years of the label. So can you give us some idea of your life prior to the label beginning and also how the concept of Cherry Red was sort of brought together?
Well, Cherry Red started as a promotion company, Cherry Red Promotions, promoting concerts mainly in Malvern, Great Malvern in Worcestershire in 1971. And at that time I was living in a house in Thornton Heath in Surrey, and one of the other people living in the house was a guy called Richard Jones, and he was at Croydon Art College. And I got quite friendly with him, and we would go and watch gigs together on Sunday nights at the Croydon Greyhound. It's a hotel in Croydon. A guy called Steve Mason was promoting gigs there with his brother. And that got me really interested in the business side of music. And then Richard had this idea to promote concerts in Malvern, in Worcestershire, where he originally came from. And he had another friend called Will Atkinson. And the three of us went into partnership together with this company called Cherry Red Promotions. And our first gig was on the 3rd of April 1971, where we had Hawkwind and Skin Alley. And that was the beginning of Cherry Red as such. The name Cherry Red came from actually a song by a band called the Groundhogs. It was on their split album, and we all liked the Groundhogs, and we were deliberating over a name, and we just came up with this name of this song. I found out later it was also a song by the Bee Gees, but it was the Groundhogs version, if you like, that was the source of our name. Before that, I was working for a film company as accountant, and then I had obviously still a day job, and that changed every 2 or 3 years. I was then working for a recording studio as their accountant. That was my vocation. And then I got a job at a company called Bell Records, which were then a very successful label, pop label. They had basically Rollers, Gary Glitter, Glitter Band, Sherwood, David Cassidy, Barry Blue, Terry Jacks, many successful acts. And I worked there for 2 or 3 years, and then they changed their name to Arista Records, and they had people like Patti Smith and the Outlaws and Lou Reed. So that was a change of image, if you like, and a change of emphasis. And then I was offered the opportunity to become general manager of a company called Magnet Records, which was again another fairly small label. And they had similar acts to Bell. They had Alvin Stardust, Guys and Dolls, and they became quite successful with a band called Darts and an artist called Chris Rea. And I stayed there for a year or so, and it was run by a guy called Michael Levy, who became Lord Levy. He's quite famous now. And it was a situation where I got myself in where I realised that I didn't actually want to work for anybody else again. I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted to be in control of my own destiny. So at this time, Cherry Red Promotions was still a hobby, but we'd actually found a local band. Richard Jones had found this band called The Tights, a punk band from Malvern. We actually did put out the first single when I was still at Magnet on the Cherry Red Records label. And then by the time we recorded the second single, I thought, this is my chance. I'll try and make a go of having my own business and see if I can make it work. So I kind of overnight converted my my dining room in my Wimbledon apartment into an office, and off I went and started Cherry Red Records.
I'm interested in your thought process of when the label moved from being sort of a hobby to more of a full-time concern. Were you aware of sort of the spirit of independent labels on the rise as it was then? There was quite a few of what has now become iconic independent labels started around that time. Or was it a decision to go for it sort of taken in isolation?
Well, there was obviously encouragement of the whole punk thing started it, in terms of it created a window of opportunity. So 1976, the Sex Pistols had that famous, well, there was the famous punk weekend at the 100 Club in the summer of 76. It was the 100 Club on Oxford Street where there was the Sex Pistols played, Susie and the Banshees played their first gig, I think the Damned played, I think the Clash played. And that really got publicity, and there's a whole new movement that started, the punk movement. And because the big companies, the big record companies, only wanted to sign the major acts, and of course the Clash got to deal with CBS, the Banshees got to deal with Polydor, the Pistols got to deal with EMI, etc. That left a lot of other bands that were punk bands from this emerging scene that couldn't get record deals, because the big companies just wanted what they saw as the big acts. They all wanted one or two. They didn't want to sign 100 acts, understandably. So that was a climate in which a lot of new independent labels started, some by the bands themselves, others by people that liked the music and wanted to put records out. And most of them were hobbies to start with. Now, I had the advantages that I'd worked for other record companies, and I knew how the game worked to some extent, whereas most people didn't. They were novices at this. And so when you asked the question, when did it become like a full-time thing, I saw the opportunity because there was other companies like Rough Trade that started. I think Factory hadn't started, then Mute had just started. And there was a host of other smaller ones that aren't around now. And I thought, yes, I'll have a go at this. And it was as simple as that. I didn't know whether it would work. I certainly had no expectation it would still be going strong in 30 years' time. That didn't even enter my awareness. But I thought, here's a chance, I'm going to go for it. And I was single. I didn't have any family to support. So if it didn't work, I thought I'll get a job again sometime.
So would you say that the cultural and economic conditions around that time were more conducive to starting a label than, say, they are nowadays?
Well, very much so, because in those days you could press up 2,000 singles and you probably sold them no matter what the single was like, because there was a hunger around the world, not just in the UK, for interesting records on independent labels, because it was fueling something internationally, and people all over the world, kids all over the world, were hungry for something that was new in terms of music. So it was, I won't say it was easy, but it was comparatively easy. I think the thing I realised pretty early on was it was no good just putting out singles, and Cherry Red moved into putting out albums very quickly. Most labels in those days were just putting out singles and the odd album. We put out albums and the odd single. We reversed the formula, because I knew from my experience that putting out singles didn't really make your cash flow work that well. It just about kept you ticking over. But if you put albums and they sold okay, you had some extra money in the bank to expand, and that was the important thing.
So you kind of almost from the beginning had Cherry Red as a long-term concern in your mind. I know a lot of labels that started at that time were to help out friends who couldn't get a deal, as you say, and they maybe did one or two singles and stopped there. But you were always thinking down the long-term route.
Oh, I was thinking long-term-ish. I wasn't
Right.
thinking 30 years or 20 years or even 10 years. But I was thinking I'd like to be doing this in 3 or 5 years' time. Beyond that, I didn't really know what would happen. And so, I know, being an accountant as my background, I understood that you had to pay the bill. I think we all know you have to pay the bills on time, but I understood how you could achieve that. And I understood what I had to do to achieve that.
So tell us a little bit about the first 12 months, if you like. I mean, you're running your own business for the first time. You're trying to establish an independent record label. What were the challenges that you faced over that first year?
Well, as I say, I was working from my flat in Wimbledon. So I didn't have overheads of an office, working from my dining room. And I had a couple of people helping me out on a part-time basis for no money. I was taking virtually no money out. And we had a couple of singles by the Tights. And then I came across an album by a guy called Morgan Fisher, which had never been released in the UK. It had been out in Italy, but hadn't had a UK release. So I licensed that. That sold okay, sold a few hundred. But by this time I had an idea, which was a really good idea. One of my jobs at both Bell and Magnet had been licensing out our tracks to TV compilation companies. Like in those days what happened was that the hits were put together on compilations, not all by one company that was a major company, but by other companies that would license the tracks from the major companies. And there was KTEL, there was Arcade, and there was Ronco. They were the main three. And I kind of knew the people there, and I'd licensed tracks from Bell and from Magnet to them. And I thought, why doesn't someone do a compilation of these independent singles that are coming out? And no one had thought of doing that. And these tracks obviously weren't hits, but they'd done okay. They all sold a few thousand. So the first one was called Business Unusual and had 14 tracks from 14 different independent labels. And that actually sold, I think it sold about 10,000, which was very good. And I also licensed it in a couple of territories overseas. So that was the first thing that really made some money. And then I had an album by the Runaways, the all-girl group, the Runaways. And I'd seen them play a year or two earlier. They'd supported the Stranglers at the Roundhouse, and I really liked them. And I found out that they couldn't get a deal in Europe on their new album. It'd come out in America, but they couldn't get released in the UK. So I found out who was managing them and rang him up in New York and said, "Can I put your album out?" And we agreed on an advance. And then when I put it out, I pressed it all up in different colour vinyl, so it was different from the American version. And again, that sold quite well. So it was really a question of trying to find things that other people weren't doing. So I wasn't really trying to compete with the Rough Trades and the Mutes and the Factories, etc. I was trying to do different things. And that's one of the things about Cherry Red. I was never really fixed on a certain image. I was just fixed on doing things that were interesting and different. Not even fixed on that, but open to that.
So that particular, the Runaways album, you've described that in places that I've read as moving from being an amateur football team to one that's playing in the professional leagues, in the effect that it had on the company. Yeah. What in particular about that was so important for the label?
Well, people started to take us more seriously because they were a name, and they'd been on bigger labels. So I think people realised then we were a proper business as opposed to someone from their bedroom. Although, on the other hand, I was only working one floor down from my bedroom, but it was perceived as something a little bit more substantial.
And then shortly after that, of course, you found the release which has gone on to become Cherry Red's most successful in terms of sales, which is Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables by the Dead Kennedys.
Yes.
Did you kind of realise early on that you'd got such a seminal album on your hands?
Well, what happened there was, it's interesting how one thing leads to another, but we put out an album by a band called the Hollywood Brats. Again, there's a whole story there, I won't go into the whole thing, but the Hollywood Brats were really about the first punk band. They were an English band, obviously, with an American name, with actually a Canadian singer, while the rest of the band, in fact, they weren't all English because the guitarist was Norwegian, but they were based in England. And they almost signed to Bell Records when I was there, but at the last minute it was decided they didn't quite fit with Bell Records. I'd seen them play several times in London at that time. And then I knew the album was unreleased anywhere but Norway. And so we got the rights, released it in the UK, and then there was a legal dispute with, because the singer was signed to someone else, and the person I'd licensed the album from hadn't necessarily got actually the full rights, although I didn't realise that. And there was a legal dispute, and I got into meetings with the guy who managed the singer, and we sorted it all out. And then obviously the guy who managed the singer must have been reasonably impressed with the way I dealt with it, a guy called Chris Gilbert. And he called me one day and he said, my partner Bill Gilliam is managing the Dead Kennedys. They're an American punk band from San Francisco, and they're looking for someone to put an album out. And I knew about the band because they had a single called California Uber Alice out on Fast Products, Edinburgh label. That had done really well. I knew it sold really well. And so I went up to see this guy, Bill Gilliam, and we got on well. And he said to me, well, okay, you can have the album, but it's going to cost you $10,000 advance. And that doesn't sound much these days, but then it was a lot, even though I'd done okay with the Runaways. It was still a lot. So in the end, I managed to raise the money from a company called Caroline Exports, who we dealt with, their export company. I did a deal with them, and they had the exclusive export rights for 3 months at a favourable price, and they gave me the $10,000 to sign the band. So I went to San Francisco, signed the band, and was there when they were recording the album, and then basically came back, put the single out, Holiday in Cambodia, which almost charted. And of course the album came out and went straight into the top 40, which was very good for an independent label then, especially an independent label, which was just me basically in my dining room in Wimbledon. And it didn't stay in the top 40 long, I think 2 or 3 weeks. But it's one of those albums that is still regarded as a classic album, and 30 years later, as you know, it still sells 10,000 copies a year. It still sells really well. And no, I didn't know that it would be so successful. It's sold over 1 million copies now. I didn't realise it would do that. On the other hand, I knew the band would do well enough, and when I heard the album, I really liked it, and I thought, because I paid the money before I'd even heard the album, because it wasn't recorded then. But when I heard it, I knew it was something special, but I didn't think it would have the legs of 30 years, which is incredible. Cherry Red is very grateful to Dead Kennedys because that built the basis of the expansion, the early expansion of the company, and from that I could get some offices in Westbourne Grove in Bayswater, start to employ some staff and pay people and build a proper business.
So looking back on it now, that may seem quite a risk that you took at the time in order to raise the finance to get the album. Do you think that is part of the ethos of running an independent label, is you have to be prepared to take those risks?
Well, I think the rules are different now, and I wouldn't want to start a label now, not because I think I couldn't do it, because I'm a lot older, obviously, but there was pluses and minuses. In those days, remember, you only really had Radio 1. If you didn't get played on Radio 1, you got very little exposure. You had the music papers, that's true. You had 4 weekly music papers. You had Sounds, Record Mirror, Disc, and NME. Only one of them's left now, NME. The other 3 have all gone. So you tried to get your records reviewed and to get features. And radio was very difficult because you didn't get Radio 1. Then you were down to a very few regional radio stations. Radio 2 wouldn't play your records. Then all you had then was the live side. If you didn't get press and you didn't get radio, you had nothing. And now, of course, you have the wonderful world of the internet. You've got your YouTube and your MySpace and all the rest of them. You have got more ways to promote records. You have internet radio, internet TV. On the other hand, it still seems it takes a lot of money to break a band. And I think also in going back 30 years, the psychology in bands was different insofar as they were prepared to sign to you for 3 options for 3, 4 or 5 albums, and they were patient and they were willing to work hard and do part-time jobs because they wanted to build their career over time and were willing to do that. And now it seems that bands want to be successful in 3 months, and if they don't, they give up and blame the record company and all the things that go on, and it's a different world in many ways.
So you'd had relative early success for an independent label.
But it took 2 years for Dead Kennedys. It wasn't overnight. It was almost exactly 2 years. Did
you kind of at any point sort of sit down and think, I've done it, I've established the company, or was it just too busy to have time for that kind of reflection? Well,
it was a case of, there was always somewhere else to go, in terms of there was always, things in music are always changing. Not only the music's changing, the structure's changing, your opportunities change. And so it was really a case of, it was always interesting. There's always new things coming up. And the punk movement lasted so long. Then there was post-punk, and then it mutated into all kinds of things. So it was always a question of Cherry Red trying to find its way as the taste in music changed. And although, as I said, the Dead Kennedys album still sold and still sells well, most of the early records don't have that success now. Some of them still sell a bit, but it's a question of going with the times, if you like. And I think there was always a challenge there to be met by me.
So as you said, that the success of the Dead Kennedys album allowed you to invest more money in the company and build it up. And you brought in a young Mike Alway to help out on the A&R side.
Yes.
What was it that you kind of saw in Mike that made you decide he was the man that you wanted? And was it difficult to kind of have that extra input all of a sudden after you'd pretty much been making most of the decisions yourself?
Well, I was working with a guy called Theo Chalmers. He was a very opinionated guy, but quite a knowledgeable guy on music. And he was working with me for 1 day a week for free. He was just doing part-time jobs apart from that. And he was running basically the publishing side, which is a whole different story, which maybe we touch on, maybe we don't. And so when I got the Dead Kennedys to become successful in Europe, then what happened was that I put Theo on the payroll full time, and we decided we needed somebody to do this A&R side, look for the new bands and also look after the press side, which Theo and I had done ourselves before. We were okay at, but we wanted someone to really look into that, become an expert at that. And so we knew kind of the scene, especially in South London, because we were working from Wimbledon from my flat. And so Mike was a promoter. He was promoting bands in the basement of a hotel in Richmond. He called it Snoopy's. It was just in a bar of a hotel, basically. And I think he had 2 nights a week. And he's promoting bands there. He's also managing a couple of bands, one called Scissor Fits. And he used to ring me up, and he was always so enthusiastic. He used to say, Scissor Fits are the new Beatles. And I liked his enthusiasm and his belief. And he also seemed to have his, he had his fingers on the pulse locally. And he was coming up with interesting ideas. So I thought I'd just give him a shot. If it didn't work out, obviously it wasn't going to be a long-term relationship. But he was personable, people liked him, and he had many qualities. He wanted to work hard. He wanted to make something of his life, which is important. So he started, and his first day in the office, this package arrived from a band in Nuneaton called Alice in Gaza. It was basically the finished album of the tape of their finished album, Photographs as Memories, which we ended up putting out. And so it was a kind of, let's say, a bit of a lucky start for Mike in one way, but he also listened to it and spotted what was there. It was not as if it didn't take input from Mike. And he went on to sign we did albums by someone called Aid Tent. He signed Medium. He signed some things early on that weren't that successful. But he quickly got into a Stride, which was a very successful Stride, and he signed Marine Girls, who of course Tracey Thorn was in. He signed Ben Watt, who linked up with Tracey Thorn to form Everything But the Girl, and we did their first single. He signed the Monochrome Set, who were previously been on Virgin. I'm not sure they were on Virgin. Yes, they were on Din Disc, yeah. He signed Kevin Coyne, who'd also been on Virgin. The Passage had also been on Virgin. So he was looking around for bands, some who hadn't had deals before, like the Nightingales hadn't had deals before, and others who had a bit of experience and they'd either left the label or been dropped by the label because they couldn't go any further. So he quickly built up a roster, a very interesting roster of diverse people, but somehow it all still fitted together. There was an overall, not image is the wrong word, but there's synchronicity somehow.
And the kind of groove in terms of a sound that the label sort of settled into in those days was reasonably melodic, but what I would term alternative, and that it wasn't aimed at commercial success. Was there ever sort of a temptation, given the fact that you'd worked at labels who were more aimed at going down that route, to look for a band that would bring you a commercial success or make the label more commercially aimed? Or were you happy with the route that you were navigating?
Well, of course, we were also wanting to get hit records. It wasn't as if we were trying not to get hits. And for instance, the first Everything But the Girl single, Night and Day, did get a fair amount of airplay.
Whether near to me or far, no matter, darling, where you are, I think of you night and day. Day and night, why is it so that this longing for you follows wherever I go? In the roaring traffic's boom, in the silence of my lonely room, I think of you night and day.
And their second record was a big hit on when they left and signed to Blanco Negro. So, and the Monochrome Set, we were trying to make pop-sounding singles. There was an artist towards the end of Mike's reign at Cherry Red as A&R Man called The Fantastic Something, which was basically a radio record. So it wasn't as if we were anti-hits, but we were trying to do it, if you like, on our own terms, which we weren't being completely unrealistic, but somehow we didn't quite make it by getting a hit single. And we've never had a hit single. The only record we've ever had in the top 40 was by the Dead Kennedys, called Too Drunk to Fuck, and that never got any airplay. So we've never ever had a hit single.
It shows you can do it without having one.
Well, you have to adapt and you have to duck and dive a bit, but you can survive and make a living and have a reasonable company without having hits, yes.
So another one of Mike's early discoveries were a band called Felt, who were led by the enigmatic Lawrence.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your early experiences with the band?
Well, they had this, Lawrence did a single called Index, he put out himself, and he sent it to be reviewed to Sounds, and they made it single of the week. And one thing we used to do was, we had an account with the Rough Trade shop, which was very near where we were, and Mike was allowed to go around there and buy whatever he liked, basically. So he would go and buy anything that was interesting that had just come out. So Felt were playing a gig in Acton, in London, and Mike said to me, look, I really like the sound of this band Felt, let's go and watch them play. And so we went along to the gig.
I don't know why, stars in the sky, I don't know why they shine. I'm on rooftops, I'm watching raindrops, I'm on rooftops in the sky.
And they weren't so great that night, but it was interesting who was there. Just about every happening London record label was there. So there was a buzz about the band. In fact, there was more people from record companies than members of the public there. And they were shambolic, but there was something about them that Mike and I both liked. And so the next day they came in the office, I think it was just two of them. And we went out, I remember we went out to the cafe on the corner, and Lawrence was hungry, and all he would eat was chips. He wouldn't eat anything else but chips. That was his diet, I think. I think it was chips and Coca-Cola. That's all he ate and drank. So we had the chips and Coca-Cola with Lawrence. And I think he chose us from other labels because there was other interest there. And we signed them, and then we actually ended up putting 5 albums out by them, which is a lot. To put 5 albums up by a band, and there was never a hit single, never a hit album. But each album sold more than the previous album. So,
kind of outside of the bands that Mike was discovering, there were also other releases going on at the label at the time. I've just been reading some notes that Mike has contributed to for the 30th anniversary box set,
right,
which is coming out later this year. And he said that his quote was that certain releases were done to pay the wages. And he referred to the Mark Bolan album and some of the All New Sound releases that were happening around that time. Is there a semblance of truth in that?
No, there's not. It's funny because he found the Mark Bolan album. What happened was that we'd heard about this album. We knew about this album, which was by John's Children, which was a kind of a fake live album. It was basically a studio album. John's Children was the band that Mark Bolan had been in, but he left by the time they made the album. And he tracked down the rights, because this is a really collectible album. We were doing the occasional catalogue reissue item at that time, and he tracked down the rights with Simon Napier Bell. And Simon said, oh, by the way, I'm working on this Mark Bolan project, because Mark was dead by this time. And basically it was some unreleased tracks, and Simon Napier Bell had hired some musicians to put backing tracks on there in the style he felt that Mark Bolan would have done it if he'd still been alive. And he offered us this album called You Scare Me to Death. was an interesting project, and I remember Mike being pretty enthusiastic about it. You know, time does sometimes reinvent one's memory, but with Adrian Sherwood, Mike remembers it different from me. I remember actually that he introduced Adrian to me, because Adrian was very friendly with Marquis Smith, who Mike knew, Marquis Smith from The Fall, and I remember us hanging out together. So I think it came through Mike. It wasn't something that Mike felt close to A&R wise, but I'm very proud to we put out Adrian's first 5 albums, and I'm very proud to have done that. Adrian's been a very key figure over the years, and you know, doing things in a different way, especially with remixing and producing, and I think those albums stand up very much so.
So as you've said, also signed to the label at that time, you had Ben Watt and Tracey Thorn, who both recorded solo albums for the label and then went on to have great success as Everything But the Girl.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about them as solo artists, and then also how this sort of great meeting of the two came together? Well,
we signed the Marine Girls first, who had Tracey Thorn in there. We did one album with the Marine Girls. And then, I was trying to remember the sequence of events. We put that album out, and then, actually I'm not sure that was the sequence. I think actually Tracey was already writing songs on her own and wanting to record separate from the Marine Girls. I think maybe Tracey Thorn's solo album, A Distant Shore, came out before the Marine Girls album. But there wasn't that much difference in the release dates. And it was obvious really that Tracey was the one with the most talent. You know, she was the one that had the best voice, and she was the one that was the best songwriter from the Marine Girls. So she was doing her solo project, and Ben we signed as a solo artist.
Lying back in the waterless and spiky grass, looking up how the fluffy cloud seems closer now, looking down through the tumbling grass to the line of trees. All the cars on the Guildford Road are just a murmur now.
And both their albums did very well. They didn't get in the main charts, but they were many weeks in the independent charts, and the singles off the albums did well. And then they both, by coincidence, they hadn't met at this point, by coincidence, they both went to Hull University. And then Mike always suggested they meet up there, and they met up, and of course a personal and professional relationship emerged, which is still going strong.
So probably the final really significant signing of that first Mike Alway era at the label were the monochrome set, as you say.
Yes.
It seems again from Mike's notes in the 30th anniversary box set that he had a very strong belief that this was the band that could bring Cherry Red some real commercial success. Was that something that you shared?
Yes, I always felt the monochrome set, as did their previous record company, could break through.
Oh, take my heart and let it beat to the sound of dancing feet. Then take those feet and let them glide. My baby's sweet, gonna be my bride. I got a girl, she got a man. All of God's children, they clap their hands. I got a heart and she got mine. My baby's good and I feel fine. We're climbing Jacob's ladder. We're climbing Jacob's ladder. We're climbing Jacob's ladder.
They had a great image. Bib was a great singer. They had some good songs. They did get some radio play. They worked hard, but the breaks didn't really come. And when, I know this is part 2 of the story, but when Mike left and formed Blanco Negro, apart from everything but the Girl, the only other act that they signed was the monochrome set. So there was still faith in them after they left Cherry Red. It's just one of those things. Certain certain artists get the commercial breaks and something big happens and other ones don't.
And you also, during that period, released some groundbreaking compilation albums. We've mentioned the Business Unusual release. Later on, there was Pillows and Prayers.
Yes.
Which, still to this day, when I meet people around the world, they associate that release very strongly with the label. What was the kind of thinking behind that release?
Well, it was Mike's idea. Mike was very creative. He came with lots of ideas. Some were good, some were not so good, and it was always my role to try and distill the ideas and encourage and help the ones that were good ideas to blossom into something tangible, and the ones I felt weren't so good, discourage Mike from following those, because he always needed help with his focus. And I thought Pillows and Prayers was a brilliant idea. His idea was to put 17 tracks on an album, sell it for 99p, which is very cheap. At that time, it was a very, very cheap price. And we did that. It was a sampler for the label. And we were able to do that by not paying the artist royalties, explain this was a promotional album, asking the distributor to take a big cut in their fee, and generally speaking, trying to get the costs down all around. And obviously, we made as a record company no money out of it. And the idea was to sell lots of records, get lots of press, get some radio, so all the artists got publicity, and they all, as a result of that, sold more records, and it helped their career. And it seemed to work, because the album sold over 100,000 copies in a short space of time, was #1 in the independent charts, I think, for 17 weeks, was in the independent chart for a year. So it was a brilliant idea of Mike's, and it worked. And most of the artists on there, I think, got something tangible out of it in terms of profile, and also increased sales on their albums.
So you've described that early 80s period as a magical period for the label. What was there about the label at that time that made it such a rich era for you?
I think it was exciting, it was dynamic. We were going to places that maybe people hadn't gone to before. The Pillows and Prayers is a good example of that. So much happened in a short space of time. It was we were young, we were enthusiastic, and I don't know. It was just a very stimulating time.
And with the benefit of hindsight, experience, wisdom, is there anything that you think you'd have done differently or changed about that time?
Yeah, you can look back and say you changed something, but you can't change it. It was the way it was. I think, at times I was immature and made decisions that weren't the best decisions. And I think Mike, who was my key person at the time, probably felt the same. But you can't change it. It was what it was. Now is what it is now, and what we're doing now is relevant now. But I don't have any regrets as such, no. It would be interesting if Mike hadn't left and taken the main acts with him, and to see if we could have taken the whole thing to the next stage. I'm not sure whether we could or not. I felt we could, actually. He felt we couldn't, so there was a difference of opinion. But it worked out the way it did. So
finally, if you had to go back into the memory banks and pick out one memory in particular that summed up the 1978 to 83 period for you, what do you think it would be?
Oh gosh, that's a bit of a question to throw at me. One memory. Well, it's not so much one memory, it's more a series of memories that's one feeling. And I think it's very much the liveliness we had in the office. It was very dynamic, the office. We had some volatile characters who would sometimes sound off, but it was always incredibly alive, and we always felt we were going somewhere. And most of us, we were kind of working hard during the day, and we'd go out and have a drink, have a bit of bite to eat, and go and watch a band every night. So it was like a family feeling, and of course in families you get disagreements and things and people falling out, but it was a feeling we were moving towards something. Even though there was internal disagreements, we were generally moving towards something. There was a spirit there, and we were all learning. That's what I loved as well. I think we all loved that. That's what I'm left with. Just very, very intense, exciting days, and yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Next time we'll look at the following period in the label, which is the later 1980s, early 1990s, which I'm sure had its own kind of rich history and challenges as well. So join us again soon.